Ed Sullivan revealed the 9 Golden Age performers he regretted ever giving a platform to because of their racism. For 23 years, Ed Sullivan stood on the most watched stage in American television history, introducing the biggest stars in entertainment to over 50 million viewers every Sunday night. His variety show launched careers, made unknowns into superstars overnight, and shaped American popular culture like no other program. One appearance on his stage could transform a performer's entire life. Ed had more power than anyone in entertainment, explained a former Sullivan show producer. If Ed booked you, America knew your name the next morning. He was the gatekeeper, and he took that responsibility seriously. But according to those who worked closest with Sullivan, that enormous power came with a burden he carried privately for years. Ed kept notes, revealed a longtime stage manager, not just about performances, but about behavior, about what he saw backstage that audiences never knew. After certain performers left, Sullivan would quietly tell staff, "That's the last time they're on my stage." What disturbed Sullivan most wasn't demanding divas or difficult personalities. It was discovering the documented racism of performers he had introduced to America as heroes. Singers who demanded segregated dressing rooms, entertainers who built careers on black music while refusing to perform with black artists, icons whose wholesome images concealed attitudes Sullivan found genuinely disturbing. Most shocking were performers America loved most. The clean-cut singer who covered black artist songs, made millions, and never gave them credit while opposing integration. The patriotic icon who sang racist songs between performances of God Bless America. The beloved cowboy who ran a segregated entertainment empire while teaching children about fairness. And at number 1, the performer Sullivan later called the biggest mistake I ever made. The young man Sullivan gave 3 legendary appearances that launched him to superstardom. The king himself, whose entire career was built on black music while maintaining documented racist attitudes that shocked those who worked closest with him. Every time Sullivan introduced these performers, 50 million Americans watched. Every appearance gave them legitimacy and the endorsement of television's most trusted stage. And backstage, according to extensive documentation, they showed exactly who they really were. But first, we need to understand why the clean-cut singer at number 9 earned Sullivan's regret, and how the performer who seemed like the wholesome alternative to dangerous rock and roll was actually something far more troubling. Starting with number 9. Number 9, Pat Boone, the clean-cut singer who stole black music and opposed integration. When Pat Boone performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, 50 million viewers saw everything Sullivan had promised. A clean-cut, well-mannered young man who represented a safer alternative to dangerous rock and roll. With his white buck shoes and bright smile, Boone seemed to embody traditional American values. Sullivan introduced him as the antidote to Elvis Presley's rebellious sexuality. What audiences didn't see was the calculated business model behind Boone's wholesome image, built on systematically covering songs by black artists, releasing sanitized versions that white radio would play, and making millions while the original black artists saw their work stolen. Between 1955 and 1959, Boone had massive hits that made him one of America's biggest stars. Ain't That a Shame by Fats Domino, Tutti Frutti by Little Richard, Long Tall Sally by Little Richard. Every single one was originally recorded by a black artist. Boone's versions, stripped of their original energy, made him wealthy while the original artist struggled to get airplay on white radio stations. According to music historians, Boone's label had a systematic approach. They monitored what black artists were recording, rushed Boone into the studio to record sanitized versions, then used their connections to white radio to ensure Boone's versions reached larger audiences first. Little Richard later described the pain of watching Boone's version of Tutti Frutti climb the charts while his original was relegated to race records sections. "Pat made my songs into nursery rhymes," Richard wrote. "He took everything that made them alive and turned them into something safe for white people." What made Boone's behavior particularly troubling was how he combined cultural theft with political opposition to integration. During the late 1950s, Boone was documented making public statements opposing integration and supporting segregationist policies. A 1958 incident, documented by Sullivan Show staff, revealed Boone's attitudes. When Sullivan considered booking a black musical guest on the same episode as Boone, Boone's management made it clear he preferred not to appear on integrated programs. Sullivan was disturbed enough that he seriously considered canceling Boone's appearance. According to Sullivan's wife Sylvia, Ed would watch Boone's performances from the wings and shake his head, troubled by the disconnect between the wholesome image and the documented behavior. Sullivan came to view those bookings as mistakes that prioritized ratings over integrity. Boone never publicly acknowledged the ethical problems with his career model and never advocated for the black artists whose work made him famous. His wholesome Christian image remained intact, concealing a business built on systematic cultural theft. While Boone's racism was wrapped in clean-cut commercialism, Sullivan's next performer combined patriotic imagery with documented racist content that shocked those who discovered it decades later. Number 8. Kate Smith, the patriotic icon who sang racist songs. When Kate Smith performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, viewers saw one of America's most beloved voices. The woman whose rendition of God Bless America became synonymous with patriotic feeling. Her warm, powerful voice made her seem like the embodiment of American values. Sullivan introduced her on patriotic episodes as the voice of the nation itself. What audiences didn't know, according to documented recordings discovered decades later, was that the same voice that sang God Bless America had also recorded explicitly racist songs in the 1930s, and that Smith had spent years performing exclusively for segregated audiences. In 1931, Smith recorded a song called That's Why Darkies Were Born, which contained lyrics that romanticized slavery. The recording, documented in music archives, showed Smith performing material that justified racial oppression. Multiple recordings from her early career contained similar content. According to music historians, she performed in blackface in some of her early radio appearances, a practice she continued into the late 1930s. These performances were documented in radio archives and contemporary reviews. What made Smith's situation particularly troubling for Sullivan was her insistence on performing only for segregated audiences well into the 1950s and 1960s. A 1956 incident, documented by civil rights organizations, showed Smith canceling a performance rather than performing for an integrated audience. Smith's management made it clear that integrated seating was unacceptable. On The Sullivan Show, according to backstage staff, Smith demanded that any backup singers or musicians who appeared with her be white. A 1960 incident documented by stage managers revealed Smith objecting to black stagehands being visible during her performance. Sullivan, who had begun featuring more black performers by the late 1950s, found Smith's demands increasingly problematic. According to his producer, Sullivan would accommodate her requests to avoid on-air incidents, but privately expressed discomfort with continuing to give platform to someone whose racial attitudes contradicted the patriotic values her signature song supposedly represented. What particularly troubled Sullivan was the hypocrisy of Smith singing God Bless America while excluding black Americans from her definition of who deserved to be blessed. Ed would say, "She sings about America, but only means part of it," Sylvia Sullivan revealed in a biography. When Smith's racist recordings became public in 2019, causing controversy, many expressed shock that the patriotic icon had such a documented racist history. Sullivan never knew about those specific recordings, but he knew enough about her segregationist performance policies to regret giving her the platform that helped maintain her image as America's voice. While Smith wrapped her racism in patriotism, Sullivan's next performer concealed his behind a smooth, relaxed image that made his systematic exclusion seem almost invisible. Number 7. Perry Como, Mr. Nice Guy who excluded black performers. When Perry Como performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, viewers saw the embodiment of relaxed entertainment. The crooner, known as Mr. Relaxation, seemed incapable of tension or conflict. His smooth voice and gentle demeanor made him appear uncomplicated and pleasant. Sullivan introduced him as television's perfect gentleman. What audiences didn't see was how Como's relaxed image concealed systematic racial exclusion maintained across decades of television production. Como's television show ran from 1948 to 1963, 15 years during the height of the civil rights movement. According to network diversity reports, Como's show featured virtually no black performers in any capacity during that entire run. Not as guest stars, not as backup singers, not as musicians in his orchestra. According to production documents discovered in NBC archives, Como had approval rights over all musical arrangements and guest bookings. Multiple proposals for black musical guests were documented with notations indicating Como's rejection. A 1957 incident documented by Como's musical director revealed his attitude clearly. When the director suggested integrated backup singers for a Christmas special, Como allegedly responded that his audience expected a certain kind of show and that integrated performances would be uncomfortable for viewers. According to concert promoters who worked with Como, his contract specified all white orchestras and backup performers. A 1962 contract explicitly stated that Como's touring orchestra would contain no black musicians. On The Sullivan Show, according to backstage staff, Como was notably uncomfortable when black performers were scheduled on the same episodes. A stage manager recalled that Como would time his arrival and departure to minimize backstage interaction with black guests. Sullivan noticed Como's discomfort. Ed would sometimes book Perry on the same show as black musical guests specifically to see how he'd handle it. A producer revealed, Perry was professional on camera, but backstage he made his discomfort obvious. Como's musical style was heavily influenced by black jazz and blues singers, yet he never publicly credited those influences, never advocated for black performers, and maintained segregated professional spaces throughout his career. Sullivan's bookings of Como became less frequent in the 1960s, though Como remained popular with older viewers. Sullivan never publicly addressed his reasons, maintaining typical discretion about performer relationships. While Como's racism was quiet and systematic, Sullivan's next performer represented something more visible, a career maintaining complete racial exclusion for over 3 decades. Number 6. Lawrence Welk, the bandleader who hired only whites for 31 years. When Lawrence Welk appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, viewers saw the wholesome bandleader known for champagne music. His heavily accented English and genuine delight in his music made him seem incapable of anything but wholesome values. Sullivan introduced him as the bandleader who made music for everyone. What audiences didn't see was that Welk's orchestra, which he led for over 30 years of national television, maintained a policy of complete racial exclusion. From 1951 until 1982, Lawrence Welk's orchestra employed exactly 0 black musicians, 31 years of weekly television. Not one black musician ever played in his orchestra. According to musicians who auditioned over the years, the racial exclusion was explicit policy. A black trumpet player who auditioned in 1965 recalled being told directly that Mr. Welk prefers to keep the orchestra traditional, language he immediately understood meant whites only. What made Welk's exclusion particularly troubling was its persistence through the civil rights era. While other shows slowly began integrating in the late 1950s and 1960s, Welk maintained his all-white policy without wavering. Network diversity reports repeatedly flagged Welk's show as one of television's least diverse programs. Multiple orchestra members documented in later interviews that Welk personally reviewed all hiring decisions and that his preference for all-white orchestras was well understood. Everyone knew the rules, one former member revealed. Larry wanted a certain look, and black musicians didn't fit that look. On The Sullivan Show, Welk's all-white orchestra stood in stark contrast to Sullivan's increasingly integrated productions. A 1964 incident showed the contrast clearly. When Welk appeared, he allegedly commented that Sullivan's orchestra looked different from what he was used to, a remark staff understood as thinly veiled discomfort with integration. Sullivan, who had been consciously integrating his production staff throughout the early 1960s, found Welk's unwavering segregation increasingly difficult to ignore. According to his producer, Sullivan would reference Welk when discussing diversity, using him as an example of attitudes that needed to change. What particularly troubled Sullivan was Welk's complete lack of awareness about the problem. Welk genuinely seemed not to understand why anyone would question his hiring practices, viewing his all-white orchestra as simply maintaining his style. Welk died in 1992 without ever acknowledging that his 3-decade policy of complete racial exclusion might have been wrong. His legacy as a beloved bandleader remained intact, with most obituaries barely mentioning the systematic discrimination that characterized his career. While Welk's racism was visible to anyone counting, Sullivan's next performer represented entertainment's earlier era of explicit racism through blackface performance. Number 5. Sophie Tucker, the vaudeville star who performed in blackface. When Sophie Tucker performed on The Ed Sullivan Show in the 1950s and early 1960s, viewers saw a living connection to vaudeville's golden age. The singer, known as the last of the Red Hot Mamas, was already a legend. Sullivan introduced her with reverence, as a pioneer who had paved the way for so many others. What many didn't know, though it was documented in theater histories, was that Tucker's early career had been built partly on blackface performances and on appropriating black musical styles, while treating actual black musicians as inferiors. Tucker began performing in blackface in the early 1900s, a practice she continued into the 1920s. According to vaudeville historians, theater managers believed her unconventional appearance made her unsuitable for straight performance. The blackface would distract from her looks, and allow audiences to focus on her voice. According to Tucker's own 1945 autobiography, she viewed blackface as simply theatrical makeup, no different from any other stage costume. Even writing decades later, she expressed no regret or recognition that blackface was harmful. What made Tucker's blackface particularly troubling was that her musical style was heavily derived from black jazz and blues singers. She studied and imitated black female jazz singers, then performed those styles in blackface for white audiences who wouldn't attend performances by actual black singers. Tucker's relationship with actual black musicians was often exploitative. Multiple testimonies describe Tucker treating them as employees to be directed rather than artists to be respected. A black pianist who worked with Tucker in the 1930s described her taking credit for musical arrangements he had created. By the time Tucker appeared on Sullivan's show, she had long since stopped performing in blackface. But according to Sullivan's show staff, her attitudes hadn't evolved. A 1959 incident, documented by a stage manager, showed Tucker commenting that a young black singer waiting backstage wouldn't have been allowed backstage in her day, and maybe that was better because everyone knew their place. Sullivan, who by the late 1950s was consciously featuring more black performers, found Tucker's attitudes increasingly difficult to accommodate. According to his producer, hearing her dismissive comments about black performers changed his perspective from nostalgic affection to disappointment. Tucker's final appearance was in 1963, 2 years before her death. Sullivan maintained professional courtesy but had privately decided it was time to stop featuring performers whose racial attitudes belonged to an earlier century. While Tucker represented old entertainment's explicit racism, Sullivan's next performers showed that even rock and roll's supposed progressiveness could conceal troubling attitudes. Number 4. The Rolling Stones. The band who demanded all-white backstage crews. When the Rolling Stones performed on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, American audiences saw British bad boys who claimed to love American blues music with authentic passion. Mick Jagger spoke about worshipping muddy waters. Keith Richards called black blues guitarists his teachers. They named their band after a Muddy Waters song. Everything about their image suggested genuine respect for black musical traditions. What audiences didn't fully understand was that the Stones' relationship with black music was more complicated than their public image suggested. They loved black music enough to build careers on it, but their attitudes toward actual black people revealed prejudices that contradicted their claims of musical devotion. According to Sullivan Show staff members, the Stones were noticeably uncomfortable with black crew members. A stage manager who worked their 1965 appearance recalled the band's management requesting that their dressing room be serviced only by white staff, creating tension with Sullivan's increasingly integrated backstage crew. What made this particularly troubling was the contrast with their public statements. In interviews, they spoke eloquently about black musicians. Backstage, they maintained segregated social spaces that excluded black workers. In a 1965 interview with Melody Maker, Jagger made comments about black neighborhoods using offensive stereotypes. When called out by black British musicians, Jagger defended his comments as just observations rather than apologizing. Keith Richards made comments about black musicians that revealed patronizing attitudes, praising their natural rhythm and instinctive feel, language that reduced black musical achievement to biological factors rather than recognizing sophisticated artistic development. What particularly troubled Sullivan was discovering that the Stones made significantly more money covering black blues songs than the original artists earned. Muddy Waters, whose song inspired their name, struggled financially while the Stones became millionaires from his innovations. The Stones' tours in the American South in the mid-1960s performed in segregated venues without protest. While not enforcing segregation themselves, their willingness to perform under those conditions while claiming to respect black music revealed troubling priorities. Sullivan's discomfort grew over their multiple appearances. He recognized their commercial value but privately questioned whether continued platform to performers whose offstage behavior contradicted their public claims served his audience well. While the Stones' racism was masked by claims of musical respect, Sullivan's next performer showed that even Hollywood's most sympathetic figures could harbor shocking attitudes. Number 3. Judy Garland. Dorothy, who used racial slurs backstage. When Judy Garland performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, viewers saw perhaps Hollywood's most sympathetic figure. The star of The Wizard of Oz, whose struggles with addiction and MGM's exploitation had made her a symbol of Hollywood's cruelty. Sullivan introduced her with extra gentleness, recognizing her as someone who needed protection. What audiences didn't know was that the victim narrative that made her sympathetic concealed a pattern of racist behavior that shocked those who witnessed it. The woman America wanted to protect was capable of inflicting harm on others, particularly black performers and musicians. Garland's relationship with Lena Horne, documented in both performers' biographies, revealed troubling dynamics. While Garland publicly praised Horne's talent, she never advocated for equal billing or equal treatment. According to MGM Records, Garland had approval rights over publicity materials and never pushed for Horne to receive comparable recognition. What was more troubling, according to multiple musicians who worked on Garland's 1960s concert tours, was Garland's documented use of slurs when frustrated or under the influence. These accounts, published in musician memoirs decades later, described Garland using offensive racial language during rehearsals and backstage. A pianist who toured with Garland in 1964 documented that Garland would use slurs casually during sound checks, creating uncomfortable tension among the integrated touring crew. Garland seemed unaware that her language was offensive, or perhaps didn't care because those she was offending had no power to challenge her. The Judy Garland Show, which aired during 1963-64, featured notably limited black representation, despite being produced when other variety shows were beginning to integrate more substantially. The show occasionally featured black musical guests, but rarely included them in comedy sketches or sustained segments suggesting equal status. A 1967 incident, documented by multiple witnesses at a New York nightclub, revealed Garland's attitude starkly. Garland made derogatory comments about black audience members she believed were being disruptive, comments that shocked staff and patrons who overheard them. What made Garland's racism particularly painful was the betrayal of her symbolic status. As someone who represented survival and resilience, she had become an icon for marginalized communities. The discovery that she harbored racist attitudes revealed that victimhood doesn't automatically create solidarity with others facing oppression. Sullivan was reportedly troubled when staff shared their observations about Garland's backstage comments. According to his producer, Sullivan had initially dismissed reports, but multiple consistent accounts eventually convinced him that her behavior reflected actual attitudes. Garland died in 1969, her tragic narrative intact. Most obituaries focused on her talent and suffering, barely touching on the documented accounts of her racist behavior. While Garland's racism was complicated by her victim status, Sullivan's next performer wrapped his discrimination in wholesome cowboy values. Number 2. Gene Autry, the singing cowboy who segregated everything. When Gene Autry performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, viewers saw one of Hollywood's most beloved cowboys. His cowboy code preached fairness, helping those in need, and treating everyone with respect. Sullivan introduced him as a genuine American hero. What audiences didn't see was that Autry used his enormous wealth to maintain systematic racial segregation across every aspect of his entertainment empire. The cowboy who preached fairness ran a business operation that systematically excluded black Americans from opportunities. Autry owned multiple radio stations from the 1940s through the 1970s. According to documented playlists and station policies, these stations had explicit policies against playing music by black artists. A 1952 internal memo stated clearly that music by black performers would not be aired, regardless of popularity. His television production company maintained completely white casts across hundreds of episodes. According to production documents, Autry personally approved all casting decisions. In over a decade of production, he never cast a black actor in a speaking role. Multiple former employees documented that Autry's companies had unwritten but well-understood policies against hiring black workers in positions of authority or visibility. Everyone knew Gene wanted to keep things traditional. One former assistant revealed, traditional meant white. Autry's rodeo events enforced segregated seating where segregation was legal. Unlike some touring shows that refused to perform under segregated conditions, Autry's business managers accepted and enforced local segregation laws without protest. A 1956 incident showed Autry refusing to condemn segregated housing policies in neighborhoods where he owned property. When asked to support integrated housing, Autry declined, citing concerns about property values. Language activists recognized as coded justification for segregation. When Autry purchased the California Angels in 1961, the team under his ownership became one of baseball's least diverse. Multiple black players documented that the Angels had a reputation as reluctant to sign black players and uncomfortable for black players who did sign. Sullivan, who had watched Autry's movies as a young man, became increasingly troubled by the disconnect between the Cowboy Code's values and Autry's business practices. Sullivan would reference Autry when discussing hypocrisy in entertainment. Autry died in 1998, with his wholesome image intact. Most obituaries focused on his entertainment success, barely mentioning the systematic discrimination that characterized his business empire. But if Autry's hypocrisy troubled Sullivan, his #1 performer represented something even more painful: the realization that Sullivan's most famous booking had been a terrible mistake. Number 1. Elvis Presley. The king who used racial slurs and stole black music. When Elvis Presley appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show for the first time on September 9, 1956, over 60 million Americans tuned in, making it one of the most watched broadcasts in history. Sullivan, who had initially refused to book Elvis, was launching a superstar whose influence would shape popular culture for generations. According to those closest to Sullivan, that booking became one of his deepest regrets, not because of Elvis's controversial performance style, but because of what Sullivan learned about Elvis's documented racist attitudes toward the black musicians and traditions that made Elvis's entire career possible. Elvis built his career on black music. He recorded songs originally performed by black artists, studied black gospel in Memphis churches, learned his performance style from black performers on Beale Street. Rock and roll itself was a black musical innovation that Elvis popularized and profited from. But Elvis's musical debt to black artists didn't translate into respect for black people. The contrast between his professional dependence on black musical innovations and his personal attitudes created a hypocrisy that troubled many who worked with him. Multiple sources documented Elvis making derogatory statements about black people, including comments that suggested their only value to him was commercial. While Elvis later denied some statements, multiple black musicians who worked in Memphis during Elvis's rise documented hearing similar sentiments from him or from people close to him. What's not disputed is Elvis's refusal to publicly credit the black artists who influenced him, or to use his platform to advocate for black musicians. Sam Phillips, who discovered Elvis, later acknowledged that Elvis was uncomfortable discussing his debt to black music, preferring to present his style as more original than it was. B.B. King carefully acknowledged that Elvis was personally cordial, but avoided any public association suggesting black mentorship. Little Richard stated in multiple interviews that Elvis never publicly acknowledged Richard's influence on him, despite borrowing heavily from Richard's performance style. According to Graceland staff members, Elvis maintained segregated social circles throughout his life. While he worked professionally with some black musicians, his personal life remained predominantly white. Black employees at Graceland were largely limited to service positions. On The Sullivan Show, according to backstage staff, who worked all 3 Elvis appearances, Elvis showed visible discomfort with black crew members. A stage manager documented that Elvis preferred interacting primarily with white staff, creating uncomfortable dynamics on Sullivan's increasingly integrated backstage. What made Elvis's racism particularly troubling was the timing. Elvis rose to fame during the Montgomery bus boycott, during the integration of Little Rock, during the beginning of the civil rights movement. He had enormous influence with young white Americans forming attitudes about race. His silence on integration, his refusal to support black musicians or black equality, represented a significant lost opportunity. Sullivan initially didn't recognize the fuller implications, focused on Elvis's controversial performance style. Only later, as Sullivan became more conscious of racial justice and began featuring more black performers, did he understand what he had actually done in giving Elvis those 3 legendary appearances. According to Sullivan's wife Sylvia, Ed would watch civil rights news coverage in the 1960s and comment about Elvis. He'd say, "I made him America's idol, and he never once used that influence for good," Sylvia revealed. Ed felt he'd given enormous power to someone who used it only for himself. A 1968 incident on Elvis's comeback special revealed his attitudes hadn't evolved. According to NBC crew members, Elvis objected to having black dancers in certain segments, preferring to keep performances segregated by scene. Sullivan's final years included increased reflection on his legacy. Among his regrets was giving Elvis the platform that launched him to superstardom. Ed would say, "I thought I was just booking a singer," his producer recalled. "I didn't realize I was crowning a king who would rule over stolen territory." The ultimate irony was that Elvis, the king of rock and roll, built that kingdom on black musical innovations while maintaining documented dismissive attitudes toward black people. Sullivan gave him the crown, and he regretted it for the rest of his life. Elvis died in 1977, 3 years after Sullivan. His status as a cultural icon secure, most tributes focused on his musical legacy, barely mentioning the documented contradictions between his musical debt to black artists and his personal attitudes toward black people. These weren't isolated incidents or products of a different era. These were deliberate patterns of discrimination by performers who used their platforms to entertain millions while maintaining attitudes that harmed black Americans. Sullivan's role was complex. He gave these performers platforms, introduced them to 50 million viewers as worthy of celebration, and in doing so gave legitimacy to people whose backstage behavior betrayed the values his show claimed to represent. Pat Boone's cultural theft, Kate Smith's racist songs, Perry Como's systematic exclusion, Lawrence Welk's decades of all-white hiring, Sophie Tucker's blackface legacy, the Rolling Stones' appropriation, Judy Garland's documented slurs, Gene Autry's segregated empire, and Elvis Presley's theft of black musical innovations while maintaining racist attitudes, all were made more successful and influential by appearing on Sullivan's stage. Sullivan couldn't undo those appearances, but according to family members, he eventually understood what he'd been part of, and that understanding changed how he thought about his legacy. The man who introduced America to its biggest stars eventually recognized that some of those introductions were mistakes that prioritized entertainment over justice. Which revelation shocked you most? Did you know about these documented patterns? Sullivan's stage was America's stage, and we need to understand who we elevated. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this exploration valuable, don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from entertainment's complicated past. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.